All right, Kian. So, first question that I have for you, sociology. So you're a sociology major, correct?
Hmm.
Do you feel like that helps you with your writing at all? Do you see that it translates literally for you?
Absolutely. I actually graduated recently, a few months ago. Um, it definitely did translate into, I don't know, like I feel like if you are really knowledgeable in whatever it is, you can always bring that into your writing. For me, it was the understanding of how society works in many ways. So, one thing that I had a huge focus on is the institution of religion in the fantasy world, for example, which is something that, my sociology major did help me with.
Right.
Yeah.
So, question, and everybody has a completely different like take on this. And every time I ask someone, I myself can never really get like a definitive answer. What do you consider the difference between high fantasy and urban? Like, where do you feel like the line is crossed when you're into high fantasy, and when do you feel like that line is crossed over into grim dark?
Okay, so specifically like high fantasy and grimdark is
Sure.
yeah. Yeah, I mean it's really really interesting. I've read reviews from certain individuals who are like, um either they dislike it because like it's too grimdark, or they say it's not grimdark enough. And I've had the other side of things where people loved it, but they said it's not really grimdark, and others have said, oh, it's grimdark and that's why I love it.
Right.
Um and I think the clearest answer to your question is that there is no answer here. It's more of a vibe. There are, groundworks where they're like a bleak world, check kind of, um, a sense of hopelessness, characters who are in some sense morally gray. I've had, like Dom from Books with Dominish. He said that he really enjoyed the book, but he didn't get the sense of grimdark because he felt like there was always hope, and there were other people who are like, you really sense the hopelessness. I think I'm going to answer this in a different way within regards to 11th Cycle. I feel like I tackled 11th Cycle in a much, much different way, perhaps to most Grimdark, in the sense that I didn't want, for the most part, like very blunt and bludgeoning writing. I wanted writing that was more, like, what's the word? Like, I wanted there to be a sense of a morose beauty to it, of like a melancholy, a haunting, painting sort of, and I hope that came across in certain sections. Um, and when you compare that to, I don't know, George R. R. Martin's writing, which is very brute force, it is very blunt for a very, obvious reason, and that was my take, let's say, on Grimdark.
So there, you bring up your writing style, and when I'm reading the Delilah character, she's very reminiscent to me of Helena. I don't know if you've had the chance to read Richard Swan's the Judgment of
No,
series.
that is so up there on my TBR. Like the concept is so intriguing, and I love it when you have like different stuff from different genres coming together, and I'm really excited for that one. But no, not yet.
Well, when you do get the chance, like I think it's something that you'll really get a lot out of because yourself and Richard Swan, two very upcoming fantasy writers, there's definitely a lot of parallels between you two writing styles, and the way that you two write young women. I think it's very similar. When I was reading Delilah and Nora, I thought like one of the shining factors I think that you were able to accomplish is that everyone has a very unique family, and that really gets lost in a lot of different fantasy stories. You have the person, their father gets murdered and now they're on the venge story, and that's pretty much it. But here everyone has a story that's very identical to Chroma's parents, or his mother is very identical to him. What Norma is going to is very identical to her and Delilah. Everyone has a very broken family, but it's very original to themselves, to where you never feel like you're being told the same thing continuously. um,
Yeah,
how did you feel like discovering those voices for those individual characters came along?
that's a great question. I think and I don't know if this is intentional, but I think the more I write, the more stories I write, family does end up playing a role in the development of the characters. And we briefly touched on like, hey, does sociology help me? There is work from like Karl Marx where he said that your environment growing up impacts how you develop, which is now we understand it as very common sense, but that's the way I wrote these characters. Nora specifically being an individual who, everybody believes her to be steadfast and resolute and never shies in the face of any danger, but they don't know that actually the one thing that she's most deeply afraid of is her family, is like regressing back to that sense of helplessness with the lack of control that she had when younger. Chroma, it's a lot about identity crisis, refugee, but like his heritage is being a warrior. So it is a lot of that. And I think I really enjoy reading and writing about going into the depths of how the family impacts their own inner demons and their consciousness. Yeah.
Okay. What's your favorite part of lore writing as a whole when it comes to world building?
Oof. I think it's like picking a favorite child, twisting my arm like that. I know. I think it all just comes together. I can say that within the world of the Eleventh Cycle, the one thing that I'm most excited about is the concept of the forgotten, for example, because I think there's so much you can do
Sure.
there, and I think that's a way of uh, uh, writing a story very, very subtly. And there is an Easter egg, like very specifically for that a lot of readers have already picked up within 11 Cycle, referencing that. And I really enjoyed writing about that. I think what I will say, I really enjoyed the challenge of doing something that's a little bit outside of the box. Within 11 Cycle, like one thing that I'm like, that is such a cool idea is the fact that there is no set cosmic calendar. It is
Yeah.
the idea that the calendar is based on, or the months that there are based on how many cycles have completed, and the more months there are to a year, the longer you live. So there is that the change, the adaptation to the cosmic calendar, and it makes you as a reader kind of like change your perception of like, okay, this is not like our reality.
I always use this game as like an example when people talk about forgotten history. When I was like in elementary school, I don't know if they played it like in your hometown. We would do this game with the teacher, and we would whisper something in someone's ear, and it would keep going around the classroom all the way until it came back to the original person. And if it, you would have to see if it was still the same thing. And I always use that as an example for like fantasy novels. When fantasy is at its best, that's when lore is at its best, when there's that little bit of maybe it's true for the reader, maybe it's true for the characters, but there should be that middle line where no one is exactly sure. And that's what I think is really best about you use Game of Thrones, for example, because even the reader isn't always 100% sure of what is the true lore of the old gods and the new gods, or whatnot, the first man, the first children, etc.
100%.
So, but you compare your book a lot to Dark Souls. Um,
Hmm.
you're an avid gamer, you would say?
I used to be a lot more, but I think the older you grow and the more like, I am so very, very blessed and gifted to be able to do this as a career. And that just means that I don't have the same time that I used to commit to video games. So now a lot of like my free time is either planning more, plotting more, or it's literally just reading more so I can. But I still do like I do every now and then. Like there's a new game coming out that but it's like it's not the same as it used to be, where it's like I had loads of free time and I could just yeah. But yeah, no, I think that video games in general played a big role in me growing up and my development.
If someone came up to you, a teenager today, and they're like, "Hey, Kian, I'm playing. I've got an Xbox or a PlayStation, but I really want to get into world building. What three games would you recommend to them? Like, oh, you love world
Um,
building, you need to play these.
that is, I really like that question. And I guess in a sense, it's not just like the games don't tell you how to consider world building, but I would like tell them, hey, take a look at these games and consider why their world building might work. So Dark Souls, influenced a lot of my writing. I think that is a great study in showing and not telling the world building. Um, Other things might be, I think Horizon Zero Dawn does a
Sure.
really good job. Like maybe that's a little bit more like a little bit more exposition. But what I really like about that game is that it shows how the world building itself impacts the world. You know, you have these robotic animals that are used for mining resources, and I think that's the kind of other than that, maybe something like what was it, like one of the Civilization games, because
I've
that really
never
shows.
played any of the Civilization games. I
I played
haven't.
them ages ago. Yeah.
The closest thing I've played to them, what is it? Crusader Kings? Maybe that's like similar. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so have you ever tried Mass Effect? Maybe you might get something
I
out of that.
started. Yeah, I
Started?
started. Yeah. It's in my library, and I'm gonna be booting up because everybody from A to Z is like, you gotta play Mass. It's like, okay, I'm gonna play it. Leave me alone.
I could.
Um,
You know, it's funny. You're the first person I've ever heard put Horizon on that list, and I've always wished that they released novels for Horizon. There's some comics out there, but it is something that I think the first time I played it, I just got super immersed in the world they were building, and similarly, it's another one that benefits off playing off of forgotten knowledge and forgotten history.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it is like I love that kind of idea that hey, this is all technology, it's all machinery, but there is a sense of mysticism and like lost world and all of these ancient ruins that are basically just us. And I love that concept. And I think you can, and that's the thing. When I did 11th Cycle, I'm like, I wish there was more. There were more books that were, inspired by these games that I love. And that was my interpretation. For some people it really rings true how they see it. Others it not so much. But I would say, like, hey, if you're watching this podcast right now and wish that there was Horizon Zero Dawn literature out there, do a book inspired by that. There's obviously demand.
Right. So Brandon Sanderson, I remember him saying something along the lines of the first book that he published was actually like, I don't know, like the 10th or 12th book or something like that that he had
Yeah.
actually written. Was this the first book that you personally had written, or was this kind of something that had came along the way?
Definitely not the first book. I started writing like when I was very, very young. Um, I think it's a different question to how many books did you actually finish, right?
Sure.
Because you learn more every single time you start a new book, you make less mistakes, and then you actually learn the tricks necessary to actually finish a book that you're relatively happy with. Um, this was, I don't even I don't even know for sure. I think this might have been the sixth book altogether that I wrote. And if we really want to get into specifics, it's like the third book that I published, but I consider my second book because I never count the novella in my series. So like, yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So the funny thing too is like a lot of people, and I find it really hard when it comes into like fantasy and stuff like that, because a lot of people claim that um, they've got this new idea and it's a completely new take on a trope that's been done 1,000 times, and a lot of times it's not. It's really not. And there's like a million novels published a year. Um, and I feel like this one really does a really good job of taking everything that you don't really expect or anticipate. And I myself, I'm new specifically to grimdark. This is one of my first grimdark books. So for you, what's the first novel you specifically remember reading as a kid?
Darren Chan. That's the, like what you mentioned, like novel kid Darren Chan. I was always somebody who was drawn to the macabre. Maybe there is a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy, like being born on Halloween. But I was drawn to the vampire series, and I think that really, really hooked me. And yeah, Cirque du Soleil, or no, Cirque du Freak, sorry, not Cirque du Soleil, was the one that I was drawn to.
For me
Very young.
specifically, the first one I remember reading was C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. Um, yeah, and like as a kid, it was like right around the time the first movie was coming out, and I was like, oh man, and like everybody was crazy about the trailers and the line and everything. I was like, well, maybe I'll read it, and then like I just got hooked from there. Next thing you know, I was like a little kid reading like the first like 5, 6 books, and then that's where it all started for me. Um,
That's so interesting, especially because like I know that it is considered like, or like it was intended to be an allegory for Christianity, but that
so
didn't ring true for a lot of people, and they're like, oh, it's just a it's a great fantasy story. But yeah,
so have you ever read the first one, Magician's Nephew?
no, no, I have not.
So small spoiler for the Magician's Nephew. I don't know
And
if
yeah,
I get how like that is kind of how it would translate for the first book, because the first book kind of opens up on how Narnia was created, and it's very, very, very in the beginning there was nothing, and I
yeah,
can definitely see that. But as you progress throughout the book, throughout the series, I see where you're coming from. Definitely, it's not a strong metaphor for Christianity
yeah.
yet, by no means. What's your least favorite fantasy trope?
Um, mm, I think it depends on the genre. I don't. I am almost. I am hesitant to say, oh, I have a least favorite one, because I'm always very willing to be proven wrong. Because I think that some things can, you can get creative and do a twist on it that's really, really cool. But if I am personally, I don't like using prophecies. I feel like, sure, narratively, you can argue that they're a little bit lazy, because it's like, oh, this kid has a prophecy, so that's why they're going from farmer boy to fulfilling that quest of slaying the evil. But I think it's also a moral aspect of it that I don't like, of like that only a person born to prophecy can do great things, and that's why I usually don't like some people have mentioned, like, oh, 11th cycle, every 1,000 years the seed is fulfilling a prophecy. Like, there is a cycle to that, there is a seed that is born, but it's more like there is a system in place rather than being a prophecy itself. But yeah, I think, and I did have a novella that I wrote, I never published, but like I always think about it every now and then, the idea of two brothers. One of them is going to be born to slay the evil, and the other one will be the evil. And it's like it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy thing of, and I think that, for example, is a little bit different.
So, what do you feel is so with you saying this is your first book that you've published, like not counting a novella, what do you feel is the most feedback or most reliable, best feedback that you've gotten as a writer since this book has released?
That's a great question. I think, especially when you're going in self-pub for a book that is, 240,000 words, it is 800 pages long. And I invested a lot into, like, hey, presentation, cover art, because I thought, like, that is something that I want to focus more on. I think, 2020 hindsight, I would have loved to, and if I had the funds, like, pay more for another round of editing. And I definitely would have wanted somebody who is well versed in, like, a Shakespearean English language to really nail that. And maybe that's something that down the line I'll be like, hey, 3 books in the series, I've gone back and here is the updated version of book 2. And there is that choice of, like, where do you want to focus the funds on? And I don't regret going the route I did of like getting this cover artist that I deeply, deeply, admire and respect, because if it wasn't for that attention it got, like, and I think there are other things as well. I initially intended for the book to have a lot of the prose, like, and I won't get into the specifics of why, but I wanted each scene to be like a painting, and I was very, very careful of like, hey, purple prose. And I think that really, really worked for some people who saw what I was intending. For other people, they're like, it's too verbose. And, that is something I'm battling right now of like, do I change it a little bit? Do I change my tactic? Do I rein it in and still capture the same intent that I had? But whatever you publish, you kind of have to, take what you think for this specific series will help it grow and what won't. And that is a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah. And I always hate when like I see a lot of, regardless of who is writing the book, you see some people kind of just see something they don't like and they're very unnecessarily vocal about it. It's like, well, you don't know. This is sometimes someone's first time writing something and they've not gotten that feedback before. They don't know that maybe they went too far, or they addressed something that might have offended someone, and people just kind of run with it. And I personally, I myself, I read it and I really liked the majority of it. The things that I may not have not liked was nothing that, it was more like pacing and stuff like that. Nothing that, offended me as a person. But I felt like when writers stop trying to push the boundaries, that's when genres become completely stagnant. And that's what you do not want. That's the last thing that you want.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself transitioning to sci-fi at some point in the future?
I actually wrote a sci-fi book. I'm currently, and it's funny because you brought up Horizon Zero Dawn. It is somewhat not inspired, but there are similarities. It's and I'm editing it currently, so I hope to have it out by this year. It's about it's set in the future. Our world hints to there have been a third world war, and because man cannot be trusted in governing itself, they implement an artificial intelligence to do said governing, and that artificial intelligence, codenamed God, so God, and they print or within their factories they bring out the angels, which are just robotic angels that are there to govern and within the system that exists. Um, and it's pretty much that. It is, I guess, if I had to say, it is like a critique on religion within state law. Like that shouldn't be a thing, because then it becomes oppressive. But like, yeah, and I'm really, really happy with it. And it's very, very different. And I think some people who read 11th Cycle like, oh, this is how he's going to write all of his books. No, that is very, very specific to the style that I wanted within that world. But yeah.
Do you see yourself staying as a self-published author? Like, what's your goals, I guess, long term?
I am pretty much hybrid as far as like I can't go into specifics yet, but there was talk about like selling the foreign rights for 11th Cycle, and I do have an audiobook publisher for the book as well. As far as this series is concerned, 11th Cycle Mistland, I have been approached about, hey, like TradPub, and it wasn't like it was an agent, but it wasn't even a bad deal. The reason why, at the end of the day, I don't want to go TradPub with this series is because I have a lot of freedom of like creative freedom with the series that is very unconventional. It is
Right.
doing a lot of its own things, and I fear I won't have that same freedom going TradPub. But I do have a future series in mind. I would love to go TradPub with it, if only for the reason of like, hey, if people like that series, they end up checking out my other books as well.
Yeah, that's completely true. I think a lot of people, they get set, well, I'm a self-published author, that's what I'm going to be, or they're working with an agent or a publisher, that's where they're going to stay. Sometimes there are a lot of different paths that you can continue to take, and you're going to benefit from each one. And I constantly think like the first thing that you're going to probably see changed if you work with someone else is your cover. And when I saw your book on Amazon, the cover was the first thing that grabbed me, and as it should. I think a lot of people get stuck in the idea of, well, this is what's popular right now in fantasy covers, and they all become boring. And I saw the 11th Cycle cover, and I was like, what the is this? This is
Yeah.
absolutely gorgeous. And I just like, just sometimes you're just staring at the cover because it's so amazing. And it's like, well, if more people were willing to take the risk, more people will be willing to look at their book description, and then more people would be more likely to actually buy the book. Um, what was your, I guess, your first idea for the cover, if not this one?
hmm I from the very moment of like, I'm not one of those individuals who like finds one cover artist and would use them for every single book series that I do, because I truly believe that you need to find a cover artist that fits the mood or feel of the world that you're building. So for this one, I'm like, okay, I'm looking for a Dark Souls. No, it's a Dark Souls inspired book. I went on ArtStation and started. I looked up Dark Souls art, and I I found the one, like I wanted something melancholic, gothic, and oil painting style, even though it was digital. And I found Nino is a fantastic artist, like so good. I reached out to him and I told him what I had in mind, and he got excited about the concept. And I told him about, like, I gave him the description of an elder guard, and like, with the mask, 3 arms, and he got to work, and he like blew it out of the water. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is. So when someone's writing, there's a lot of different aspects that come to writing. There's romance scenes, there's combat, um,
Yeah.
there's just straight up just paragraphs of description sometimes.
Yeah.
What is your favorite thing to write in a book?
That's a great question. I think it is usually the very emotional confrontations between characters. I don't know what it is. Action scenes a close second, but seeing characters really put themselves out there and become emotionally vulnerable all of a sudden, and have kind of that heart to heart, it feels cathartic for me. Maybe as an individual who ends up bottling up a lot of their emotions, and this is just therapy. Um, but I really enjoy those. Yeah.
So for people who have recently read your book, what would you tell people to expect from future installments?
I think book one, and some people have noticed this, book one is very much the setup for the world itself. It introduces the main characters going forward into the next series. So even as I'm writing book two right now, and by the way, I'm so enjoying writing book two. It's really hitting off. It does get, more bleak. It is more hopeless. There is this sense that every single individual has this unspoken, very nascent fear of like, this is the end. But the things are moving a lot faster, because the setup has been done. It is moving forward, and there is a lot, and it's still taking its time with like emotional beats, but it is a lot faster in that respect.
So I find like when
hmm
reading and writing, like when I'm writing multiple POVs, I always find like if it's 4 or 5, everyone always has their favorite. If you're reading Game of Thrones, you always have your favorite. I know you don't want to compare them to your children, but when you're writing and you wrote this, who was that character that you always got to throughout the book? You're like, oh man, I can't wait to write this chapter.
I think Nora. Like, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it, but it is. There are certain things that I was really. I did a lot of research basically, and uh, it felt very different within the fantasy space, and I think that's what made me really enjoy it. And followed by I guess like Delilah and then 11 Siege. 11 Siege simply because it was so different. It felt really, really new having to write those paragraphs or those chapters in like such a abstract way. But Delilah was such a interesting character exploration as well because of a lot of things that she was dealing with. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree to that. Her character arc. Firstly, Delilah was my favorite. I'm
I'm
biased
glad.
toward her. It was something about her story, and I think like her journey, and just like the entire. I wouldn't say her story was political, but there was like political elements in her having to kind of choose what was right and what was wrong and what was religious was very, very like it was really interesting. And then there's like that murder mystery element to her story. Sorry, I don't know if I can see like I'm sorry.
No, I think that's okay. I think that's okay.
But her story arc is like to me it just kept me engaged like completely like it made each of her chapters just flew by like that and I wanted more. I'm like, man, I could easily read a Delilah like book by herself, and that's not often when I read like a book that's got 4 or 5 POVs. That for me one of them instantly I'm like, because she's the opening chapter, right? Or am I wrong?
She's chapter 1, yes.
She's chapter 1, and I remember like it starts off, and by the time that chapter ended and how it ended, I was like, what the hell? But like it was really like engaging because it really set like a status quo for where her character is in her family and where she is in life in general.
Yeah.
um, so there's a POV that's non-binary in this book.
Mhm.
What was your I guess your influence for putting this character in there, and how important was it for you to have it in there?
Um, that's a great question. I remember a while ago I was listening to the Writing Excuses podcast, and they talked about like uh, gender within fiction like that, and it was brought up like, hey, let's say you're doing a sci-fi and there is an alien race that maybe reproduces asexually, for example. And that brings up the question, like, do you then need like gender? Do you need sex in that kind of idea? And it felt similar here. You have very, very Lovecraftian beings being the elders, and they don't necessarily they don't reproduce the way mortals would, and they're so above like they're like fourth, fifth dimensional beings, sort of. They're so above, understanding of mortality that they don't need to ascribe to a gender, and but some do because they feel so linked to an idea or a concept. And in the case of the seeds, they're also born, sexless. They have no reproductive organs, and there is kind of that, if they're not born with a sex and they're part of this like very higher being kind of concept, then it's kind of like, okay, well, within their civilization, or within their kind of the race that they are, it would make sense that 11 seed, especially being said that they have no idea yet formed, that they are like a newborn child, that they have no gender to ascribe to.
All right. That's a great answer. So 2 final questions. So the seed, something that I really like about the seed, and this kind of reverts back to what you were saying about the concept of the chosen. The seed are flawed. Not everyone that has come before the 11th has led the greatest journeys in the world or been the greatest heroes ever. And I think that's a great concept because yeah, there's a cycle to when they're going to happen, but it doesn't mean they're going to be Superman. It doesn't mean that they're going to be the greatest, Macedonian king or whatever. And yes, there's a time clock for that chosen to appear, but the fact that there's like a history of good and bad it leads it leads something for the reader to grasp onto for the 11th one, because now you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if it's going to be good or bad because there's such a checky, a checky path that has happened before
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And so my last question for you:
Yeah. Please.
combat. when you write combat, what is your approach to it? Because I feel like that's probably one of the most diverse things in literary. Some people just will write a sentence and then it's completely over. Some people will super in detailed. Um, how do you approach writing combat? I realize I didn't have a question before this one, but yeah. Go ahead.
No, it's all good. I really enjoyed. I don't know. Like a part of it is that I just trust myself. I do like I go into the flow a lot of the times when I write combat, and I trust in my ability to write that. And so far, it has served me well. I think if I were to analytically dissect it, I do like the switching between short sentences, choppy sentences, and then a sudden, a little bit longer of a description, because I like the idea that it's almost like, an undulating curve in the sense that, okay, the reader is getting used to this, quick, choppy sentences, and then bam, I'm forcing you to, have to read this a little bit longer description while you're like really tense of like, no, I want to know what's next. And I think that's my style, and that's something that I personally really enjoy about, writing combat, by going back and forth between those.
And completely unrelated, I feel like it'd be like a disservice not to mention just how good of a job that the voice actors did in this this version. They were phenomenal. The combat written here was great, and it's not often that you see two voice actors for a book, male and a female. It does happen, obviously, but not often. And sometimes you will read one or listen to one, however you want to say it, and maybe the male is better than the female or the female is better than the male. There was a very strong balance here, and I never felt like I didn't like one performance, and they just knocked it out of the park, both of them. Is there anything that you would like to say, like to, I guess, any final thoughts for the 11th Cycle for readers?
I will say that I feel very lucky, very blessed to, be doing this video call with you, to be on the show. And I want to thank everyone who, gave me a shot. And I do really hope that there will be more, Dark Souls inspired novels out there. But what I've also, I knew this from the very start, is that people will have different interpretations of what that means to them. And for whoever goes out there and gives the book a try, I hope you like it. But if you don't, I really hope that you find something that resonates with you. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So thanks.
All right.